The story behind 300 began long before the cameras started rolling. Although the finished film became famous for its striking visual style and highly stylized depiction of ancient warfare, its roots stretch back through history, graphic storytelling, and decades of creative experimentation. The project represents a unique meeting point between historical legend, comic book artistry, and modern digital filmmaking. Understanding how the movie came into existence requires looking at the ancient events that inspired it, the creative vision that transformed those events into a graphic novel, and the technological advances that eventually made such an ambitious adaptation possible. The historical foundation of 300 comes from one of the most famous military confrontations in recorded history, the Battle of Thermopylae, fought in 480 BCE during the Greco-Persian Wars. According to historical accounts, King Leonidas of Sparta led a small force, including his legendary 300 Spartan warriors, against the vastly larger invading Persian army commanded by King Xerxes. While the battle ultimately ended in defeat for the Spartans, their resistance became a lasting symbol of courage, sacrifice, discipline, and a willingness to stand against overwhelming odds. Over the centuries, the Battle of Thermopylae inspired countless books, paintings, poems, and historical analyses. Historians debated the exact size of the Persian army, the political motivations behind the conflict, and the accuracy of many ancient accounts. Nevertheless, the legend endured because it spoke to universal themes rather than simple military victory. The Spartans' determination to fight despite impossible circumstances transformed the battle into one of history's most enduring stories of heroism. One person who became fascinated by this legend was comic book creator Frank Miller. Miller had already established himself as one of the most influential writers and artists in modern comics through works such as The Dark Knight Returns, Batman, Year One, and Sin City. His storytelling style emphasized larger-than-life heroes, dramatic visual compositions, morally intense conflicts, and heavily stylized violence. Rather than aiming for historical realism, Miller often focused on mythic storytelling, where emotional truth carried more importance than factual precision. Miller's fascination with the Spartans reportedly began during his youth after watching the 1962 film The 300 Spartans. That earlier movie presented the Battle of Thermopylae in a traditional historical epic style. Although Miller admired the story itself, he imagined presenting it in a much more visually dramatic and emotionally heightened way. For years, he carried the idea with him, waiting until he felt capable of doing justice to the legendary conflict. Eventually, Miller collaborated with colorist Lynn Varley to create the graphic novel 300. Published in 1998, the work was not intended as a strict historical reconstruction. Instead, it embraced the nature of myth and legend. Every page was designed to resemble an ancient heroic tale brought to life through modern comic book art. The exaggerated physiques of the Spartans, the monstrous appearance of many Persian soldiers, and the bold use of color all reinforced the idea that readers were witnessing history as remembered through heroic storytelling rather than objective documentation. The graphic novel quickly attracted attention for its distinctive visual identity. Instead of following traditional comic layouts, Miller frequently employed wide horizontal panels inspired by cinematic framing. Action scenes flowed across the pages with remarkable clarity, while dialogue remained concise and dramatic. The artwork emphasized silhouettes, sharp contrasts, and carefully choreographed combat, making readers feel as though they were watching an epic film frozen into illustrated moments. Hollywood had already begun looking more seriously at comic book adaptations during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Advances in digital effects made increasingly ambitious visual storytelling possible, while successful superhero films demonstrated that audiences were willing to embrace stylized source material. However, adapting 300 presented unique challenges. Unlike superhero comics with lengthy ongoing stories, Miller's graphic novel was relatively short and relied heavily on its visual presentation rather than complex plot development. Many filmmakers recognized that simply translating the story into a conventional historical epic would lose much of what made the graphic novel special. The exaggerated visual style was central to its identity. Without preserving that aesthetic, any adaptation risked becoming just another ancient war movie rather than something distinctive. Around this same period, director Zack Snyder had begun establishing himself in Hollywood. After directing commercials and music videos, he gained significant attention through his 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead. That film demonstrated Snyder's ability to combine intense action with polished visual craftsmanship. Producers noticed his talent for creating memorable imagery and maintaining strong pacing during large-scale action sequences. When discussions about adapting 300 became more serious, Snyder emerged as a promising choice because he expressed enthusiasm not only for the story, but also for faithfully recreating the graphic novel's visual language. Rather than viewing the comic merely as inspiration, he envisioned using it almost as a storyboard for the film itself. Warner Brothers became involved in developing the project after recognizing both the growing popularity of comic book adaptations and Snyder's potential as a visual filmmaker. The studio understood that 300 would not appeal primarily through historical accuracy, but through its unique artistic presentation. This allowed the filmmakers greater creative freedom to pursue an unconventional approach instead of competing directly with more traditional historical epics like Gladiator or Troy. Screenplay development became an important stage in shaping the adaptation. Kurt Johnstad was brought in to write the screenplay, working closely with Snyder to preserve the essential spirit of Miller's graphic novel while expanding certain dramatic elements necessary for a feature-length film. Since the original graphic novel maintained a relatively simple narrative structure, additional scenes were needed to provide greater emotional depth and narrative balance. Every memorable film is shaped by the perspective of its director, but few modern movies reflect the personality and artistic instincts of a filmmaker as completely as 300. While the source material by Frank Miller provided the foundation, it was director Zack Snyder who transformed the graphic novel into a cinematic experience unlike anything audiences had seen at the time. His approach to visual storytelling, action choreography, digital filmmaking, and mythic symbolism defined nearly every frame of the finished movie. Rather than attempting to recreate ancient Greece through realism, Snyder sought to create a living painting, a motion comic, and an epic legend all at once. To understand Snyder's vision for 300, it helps to understand his background as a visual storyteller. Before directing feature films, Snyder spent many years creating television commercials and music videos. This experience taught him how to communicate emotion and narrative through powerful imagery rather than lengthy dialogue. Commercials often require directors to tell a complete story within seconds, relying on composition, lighting, movement, and symbolism instead of exposition. Those lessons became evident throughout 300, where many scenes communicate ideas almost entirely through visual language. Unlike directors whose work emphasizes naturalistic performances or subtle realism, Snyder has consistently shown an interest in larger-than-life imagery. His films often explore heroes who exist somewhere between ordinary humans and mythical figures. Rather than portraying characters exactly as people behave in everyday life, he elevates them into symbols representing ideals such as courage, sacrifice, justice, or determination. This artistic tendency made him particularly well-suited for adapting Frank Miller's graphic novel, which already presented its characters as legendary icons rather than historically grounded individuals. One of Snyder's primary goals was to avoid making another conventional historical epic. By the mid-2000s, audiences had already seen films such as Gladiator, Troy, Alexander, and Kingdom of Heaven. While each approached history differently, they generally pursued a sense of realism through elaborate physical sets, practical costumes, and authentic locations. Snyder believed that attempting the same approach with 300 would actually weaken the story, because Frank Miller's work was never intended to be a literal recreation of history. Instead, Snyder repeatedly described the story as a legend being retold. This idea became the philosophical foundation for every creative decision. If the film represented a story passed down through generations rather than a documentary account, then exaggeration became not only acceptable but desirable. Heroes could appear impossibly strong. Enemies could become monstrous. Landscapes could feel dreamlike. Colors could seem almost supernatural. Every visual exaggeration reinforced the feeling that audiences were witnessing mythology instead of recorded history. This philosophy also shaped Snyder's treatment of violence. The battle scenes in 300 are undeniably brutal, featuring severed limbs, showers of blood, and intense close combat. However, Snyder did not present violence in the gritty, chaotic style common to many war films. Instead, combat became almost choreographic. Every sword swing, shield impact, spear throw, and slow-motion sequence was carefully designed to resemble an illustration from a graphic novel. Rather than emphasizing confusion or fear, the battles often feel ritualistic. The Spartans move with remarkable discipline and precision, almost like dancers performing a carefully rehearsed routine. This stylization distances the audience from the raw horror of war while simultaneously emphasizing the legendary status of the warriors. The result is violence that functions as visual storytelling rather than simple spectacle. Another defining aspect of Snyder's vision involved the relationship between speed and time. One of his most recognizable filmmaking techniques is the use of varying frame rates within a single action sequence. Instead of presenting combat entirely in real time, Snyder constantly shifts between normal speed, extreme slow motion, and sudden bursts of accelerated movement. These transitions serve several purposes. Slow motion allows audiences to appreciate the physical choreography and visual composition of each strike. It also creates moments of anticipation, giving individual actions greater dramatic weight. When the film suddenly returns to normal speed, the impact feels even more powerful because the audience experiences an immediate surge of energy. This technique became one of the movie's signature stylistic elements. While slow motion had been used extensively in cinema before, Snyder integrated it into the rhythm of action itself rather than using it only for isolated dramatic moments. The changing tempo mirrors the heightened emotional intensity of battle, transforming combat into an almost operatic experience. Lighting played an equally important role in Snyder's artistic vision. Traditional historical dramas often attempt to recreate natural lighting conditions, but 300 embraces an intentionally artificial aesthetic. Golden sunsets last longer than they realistically should. Storm clouds gather with dramatic intensity. Firelight casts exaggerated shadows across muscular bodies and polished bronze armor. Every lighting choice enhances mood rather than realism. The same philosophy guided the film's color palette. Snyder wanted every frame to resemble Frank Miller's illustrations, which relied heavily on high contrast and selective color emphasis. Warm bronze tones dominate the Spartans, reinforcing their connection to earth, discipline, and physical strength. Deep reds symbolize blood, sacrifice, and passion. Cold blues and grays often surround the Persians, creating an atmosphere of mystery and alien otherness. The extensive color grading performed during post-production ensured that every image maintained this painterly quality. Snyder also demonstrated remarkable commitment to visual consistency. Every department worked toward a unified artistic goal. Costume design, production design, cinematography, visual effects, and makeup all followed the same aesthetic philosophy. Instead of treating these elements separately, Snyder viewed them as interconnected parts of a single visual language. One of the most distinctive qualities of 300 is the way it constructs its world. Although the story is inspired by a real historical event, the film does not attempt to recreate ancient Greece as it truly existed. Instead, it builds a world that exists somewhere between history, mythology, fantasy, and legend. Every mountain, battlefield, palace, village, and battlefield horizon is designed not simply to represent a physical location, but to communicate emotion, symbolism, and larger themes. The setting is not merely a backdrop where events happen. It becomes an active part of the storytelling, shaping the characters, influencing the audience's perception, and reinforcing the central ideas of sacrifice, freedom, and destiny. From the very beginning, the audience understands that they are entering a heightened version of reality. The landscapes possess an almost dreamlike appearance. The skies glow with dramatic shades of gold, crimson, and deep blue. Mountains rise in exaggerated formations. Clouds roll across the horizon with almost supernatural intensity. Sunlight cuts through darkness in ways that feel painterly rather than natural. These visual choices immediately establish that this world is not meant to function according to strict historical realism. Instead, it operates according to the logic of epic storytelling, where nature itself seems to respond to the emotions of the narrative. The primary setting of the film is Sparta, one of the most famous city-states of ancient Greece. Historically, Sparta was known for its military culture, rigid discipline, and highly structured society. The film embraces these historical associations, but amplifies them into something almost mythical. Rather than depicting Sparta as a complex civilization with diverse social classes, politics, commerce, and everyday life, the movie presents it as a civilization entirely devoted to producing warriors. This selective portrayal serves the story's themes. Everything in Spartan society appears designed to create strength. Children are raised with discipline instead of comfort. Weakness is treated as something dangerous. Honor is valued above personal happiness. Duty takes precedence over individual desire. Through these choices, Sparta becomes more than a geographical location. It represents an idea, a society built upon courage, sacrifice, and collective responsibility. The opening scenes establish this identity through environmental storytelling rather than lengthy explanations. The harsh mountains surrounding Sparta immediately communicate isolation. Unlike prosperous cities shown in many historical films, Sparta feels rugged and unforgiving. The rocky terrain suggests that survival itself requires determination. Nature offers no comfort, forcing its people to become resilient. The famous training sequence involving young Leonidas further develops this relationship between environment and character. The frozen wilderness where he undergoes his final trial is portrayed as both beautiful and terrifying. Snow-covered cliffs, icy winds, and silent forests create an atmosphere where civilization seems very far away. In this environment, survival depends entirely upon courage, skill, and self-control. The confrontation with the wolf carries symbolic importance beyond the immediate danger. The isolated landscape transforms the encounter into a rite of passage. The wilderness itself becomes a teacher, testing Leonidas before he can become king. This reflects one of the film's recurring ideas. The environment shapes the individual as much as any human institution. Sparta's architecture reinforces these themes. Buildings are constructed from heavy stone with simple geometric forms. Decoration remains minimal compared to the lavish Persian structures later in the film. The absence of excessive ornamentation communicates Spartan values without requiring dialogue. Every wall, courtyard, and staircase reflects discipline and practicality. Even the throne room avoids unnecessary luxury. It appears strong rather than elegant, emphasizing authority through solidity instead of extravagance. The architecture tells the audience that Spartan leaders earn respect through strength rather than wealth. This careful use of environmental storytelling continues throughout the film. Weapons are displayed openly. Shields dominate military formations. Training grounds appear as ordinary parts of daily life. Every aspect of Spartan society reinforces the expectation that citizens must always be prepared for conflict. In contrast, the Persian Empire is presented as a completely different world. Whereas Sparta values simplicity, Persia embodies excess. When the audience first encounters the Persian forces, the visual style changes dramatically. Massive armies stretch beyond the horizon. Exotic animals accompany soldiers. Strange creatures appear among the ranks. Enormous structures rise from the landscape. Everything seems larger, richer, and more mysterious. This contrast serves an important narrative function. Rather than portraying the conflict as simply one nation fighting another, the film frames it as a clash between opposing philosophies. Sparta represents discipline, restraint, and freedom earned through sacrifice. Persia symbolizes overwhelming power, luxury, temptation, and submission to absolute authority. The visual differences between the two civilizations constantly reinforce these ideas. Spartan costumes rely heavily on bronze, leather, and crimson cloaks. Persian clothing features elaborate jewelry, flowing fabrics, gold ornaments, and intricate designs. Spartan environments emphasize stone and earth. Persian settings shimmer with precious metals, polished surfaces, and decorative excess. One of the film's most memorable locations is the Persian throne room, where Leonidas first meets Xerxes. Rather than resembling a historically accurate palace, the space feels almost otherworldly. Towering columns disappear into darkness. Endless staircases create the impression of infinite scale. Incense fills the air. Soft fabrics drift in unseen winds. Exotic dancers move through the shadows. This environment reflects Xerxes himself. The palace appears less like the residence of a human king and more like the domain of a god. Every visual element encourages the audience to perceive Xerxes as someone who has elevated himself beyond ordinary humanity. The design of Xerxes' court also communicates temptation. Unlike Sparta's harsh simplicity, Persia offers luxury, pleasure, wealth, and comfort. One of the reasons 300 became such a memorable film is that it cannot be confined to a single genre. At first glance, it appears to be a historical war epic based on one of the most famous battles in ancient history. However, as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the film blends multiple genres together in a highly stylized way. It combines historical drama, action, fantasy, mythology, epic cinema, comic book storytelling, and even elements of psychological drama. Rather than trying to satisfy the expectations of only one genre, the filmmakers deliberately borrowed from several traditions to create something that felt unique. The result is a movie that is instantly recognizable because of the way it reinvents familiar genre conventions while remaining true to its own artistic identity. The most obvious primary genre is the historical epic. For decades, Hollywood has produced large-scale films centered on famous historical events or legendary civilizations. Movies such as Ben-Hur, Spartacus, Cleopatra, Braveheart, Gladiator, Troy, and Kingdom of Heaven all belong to this tradition. These films typically feature grand battles, political struggles, heroic leaders, and stories that explore the rise or fall of civilizations. They often emphasize elaborate costumes, massive sets, sweeping musical scores, and themes of honor, sacrifice, and destiny. 300 clearly inherits many of these characteristics. Its narrative revolves around one of history's most famous military confrontations. The central characters are kings, soldiers, queens, and political leaders. The story concerns the defense of an entire civilization rather than the personal ambitions of a single individual. Massive armies clash across dramatic landscapes, while speeches about freedom, duty, and courage inspire warriors before battle. In many respects, the movie embraces the classic structure of the historical epic. However, the film immediately separates itself from more traditional historical dramas through its approach to realism. Most historical epics attempt to convince audiences that they are witnessing events that could have actually occurred. Costumes are usually researched carefully. Architecture aims for historical authenticity. Characters often speak in relatively natural language despite the ancient setting. Even when filmmakers take creative liberties, there is usually an effort to maintain the illusion of historical accuracy. 300 intentionally rejects that approach. Instead of asking viewers to believe they are watching literal history, it invites them to experience history as legend. This decision shifts the movie away from pure historical drama and toward mythological storytelling. The distinction is important because myths are not primarily concerned with factual precision. They exist to communicate values, ideals, and larger truths through symbolic narratives. This mythological quality becomes one of the film's defining characteristics. Leonidas is portrayed less as an ordinary human king and more as an archetypal hero. Xerxes appears almost like a god rather than a historical emperor. Many Persian warriors resemble mythical monsters instead of realistic soldiers. Nature itself seems to respond emotionally to the conflict through dramatic skies, storms, and exaggerated landscapes. By embracing mythology, the film allows audiences to engage with its themes on a symbolic level. The Battle of Thermopylae becomes more than a military encounter. It transforms into an eternal struggle between freedom and tyranny, courage and fear, discipline and excess. Another major genre that shapes the film is action cinema. From beginning to end, 300 is built around physical conflict. Nearly every major turning point involves combat, military strategy, or preparation for battle. Yet the action itself differs significantly from conventional war films. Traditional war movies often emphasize realism, confusion, and the unpredictability of combat. Battles are portrayed as chaotic experiences where survival depends upon luck as much as skill. Soldiers struggle to maintain formation amid smoke, noise, and panic. In contrast, the action sequences in 300 are highly choreographed. Every sword strike appears carefully planned. Shield formations move with mechanical precision. Spears fly through the air almost like artistic compositions rather than random projectiles. Slow-motion photography allows viewers to appreciate individual movements before the film suddenly accelerates back to full speed. These action scenes resemble dance performances as much as military engagements. Violence becomes a form of visual storytelling rather than simply an attempt to recreate realistic combat. This approach reflects the influence of comic books, martial arts cinema, and stylized action filmmaking rather than documentary realism. The comic book genre also plays a crucial role in defining the film's identity. Although audiences often associate comic book movies with superheroes, 300 demonstrates that graphic novels can inspire adaptations without involving traditional superhero characters. Unlike many comic book adaptations that significantly alter their source material, 300 closely follows Frank Miller's visual storytelling. Numerous shots directly recreate individual comic panels. Camera angles, character poses, and even lighting frequently mirror the original artwork. This loyalty to the graphic novel influences more than just appearance. The pacing, dialogue, and emotional tone all resemble comic book storytelling. Characters speak in bold declarations rather than casual conversation. Important moments are emphasized through dramatic visual compositions instead of subtle realism. Every scene feels designed to maximize emotional impact rather than everyday plausibility. Fantasy elements further distinguish the movie from conventional historical dramas. While the basic narrative remains rooted in a real historical event, many aspects of the film belong entirely to fantasy. Gigantic elephants charge across the battlefield. Monstrous executioners tower above ordinary soldiers. The immortals wear terrifying masks that make them seem supernatural. Strange creatures accompany the Persian army. Xerxes himself appears almost impossibly tall and physically perfect. These fantasy elements are never fully explained because the film does not require rational explanations. They exist as manifestations of legendary storytelling. The audience is encouraged to view the Persian Empire through the eyes of Spartan myth rather than objective historical observation. The opening sequence of 300 is one of the most important sections in the entire film because it establishes nearly everything the audience needs to understand about the story, the characters, the themes, and the world. Within the first 10 to 15 minutes, the movie introduces Sparta, explains the values that define its people, presents Leonidas as both a warrior and a leader, establishes the mythic tone, introduces the threat of Persia, and communicates the central themes of sacrifice, freedom, courage, and duty. Perhaps most importantly, the opening sequence tells the audience exactly what kind of movie they are watching. It does not promise historical realism or subtle political drama. Instead, it announces itself as a legendary tale told with the intensity and exaggeration of myth. The film begins with narration, and that decision immediately shapes audience expectations. The voice of Dilios introduces the story not as an objective historical account, but as a memory, a legend, and a tale passed from one generation to another. Narration has long been associated with epic storytelling because it creates the feeling that the audience is hearing about events of enormous significance. Before viewers even see the main battle, they understand that what they are about to witness is something worthy of being remembered. This narrative framing is incredibly important because it provides context for everything that follows. The exaggerated visuals, larger-than-life characters, and mythological elements become easier to accept because the film positions itself as a story being retold by survivors. Legends naturally grow in scale over time. Heroes become more heroic, enemies become more terrifying, and sacrifices become more meaningful. The opening narration effectively gives the film permission to embrace stylization without needing to justify every exaggeration. The audience is then introduced to one of the film's first major themes, Spartan society itself. Through narration and imagery, the movie quickly establishes that Sparta is fundamentally different from ordinary civilizations. It is not portrayed primarily as a city of merchants, philosophers, or artists. It is presented as a society entirely dedicated to producing warriors. This introduction functions as world building, but also serves a deeper purpose. By explaining how Spartan children are raised, the film establishes the cultural values that will later motivate Leonidas and his soldiers. Courage is not treated as extraordinary in Sparta. It is expected. Discipline is not optional. It is essential. Strength is not admired from a distance. It is a requirement for survival. One of the first major images in the opening sequence is the inspection of newborn Spartan children. The narration explains that weakness is not tolerated and that only the strong are allowed to live. This moment immediately communicates the harshness of Spartan culture. The audience understands that this is a world governed by ruthless standards. From a storytelling perspective, this scene accomplishes several things simultaneously. It introduces the severity of Spartan values, creates emotional discomfort, establishes the idea that strength and survival are deeply connected, and prepares viewers to understand why the Spartans later display such extraordinary resilience. The film is essentially saying that these warriors are not ordinary men because they were never raised as ordinary people. After establishing the harsh realities of Spartan society, the film shifts its focus to the childhood of Leonidas. This is a classic storytelling technique. Audiences often connect more deeply with heroes when they witness formative experiences that shape their identities. By showing Leonidas as a boy rather than introducing him immediately as a king, the movie allows viewers to understand the process that created the legendary figure they will later follow. The training sequences serve as both exposition and character development. Instead of explaining Spartan education through dialogue, the film shows the audience what that education looks like. Young boys fight, endure pain, and learn discipline. The environment itself appears harsh and unforgiving. These scenes communicate an essential idea. In Sparta, suffering is not viewed as something to avoid. It is viewed as something necessary for growth. This belief becomes central to Leonidas' identity throughout the film. The pacing during these early moments is also significant. The film moves quickly, but it never feels rushed because each image carries substantial narrative weight. Every shot contributes information about the world, the culture, or the protagonist. The audience absorbs enormous amounts of exposition without feeling overwhelmed because the information is delivered visually rather than through lengthy conversations. The next major step in Leonidas' development comes during his final survival trial. He is sent into the wilderness alone, where he must prove himself capable of surviving without assistance. This sequence introduces another recurring theme: the relationship between man and nature. The frozen landscape immediately creates a sense of danger and isolation. Unlike the structured discipline of Sparta, nature is unpredictable and indifferent. Leonidas must rely entirely on his own abilities. This sequence functions almost like a mythological initiation ritual. Across countless myths and legends, heroes must leave civilization and confront the wilderness before they can truly become leaders. The journey into nature represents a confrontation with fear, uncertainty, and mortality. The appearance of the wolf becomes the climax of this initiation. Symbolically, the wolf represents far more than a physical threat. It embodies fear itself. Leonidas cannot become the man he is destined to become until he faces danger directly. The way Leonidas defeats the wolf is equally important. He does not overpower it through brute strength alone. Instead, he uses intelligence, patience, and strategy. This foreshadows one of the central ideas of the entire film. Discipline and tactical thinking can overcome superior numbers or physical disadvantages. The image of young Leonidas standing victorious after defeating the wolf also establishes his heroic identity. In mythological storytelling, heroes often prove their worth through symbolic encounters early in their journeys. By surviving this trial, Leonidas demonstrates that he possesses the qualities necessary to lead others. Conflict is the engine that drives every great story, and in 300 it exists on multiple levels at the same time. While the film is often remembered for its spectacular battle scenes and striking visual style, its emotional power comes from the various conflicts that constantly challenge the characters. There is the obvious military conflict between the Spartans and the Persian Empire, but beneath it are political conflicts, ideological conflicts, personal struggles, psychological battles, and moral dilemmas. Each layer increases the tension and raises the stakes until the audience understands that the outcome of the Battle of Thermopylae will affect far more than the lives of the 300 Spartans. The conflict becomes a struggle over identity, freedom, legacy, and the future of an entire civilization. The central external conflict begins with the arrival of the Persian messenger. This moment immediately establishes the primary problem that will define the rest of the film. King Xerxes demands complete submission from Sparta. The request is simple on the surface: acknowledge Persian authority and avoid destruction. However, beneath those words lies a much larger issue. Accepting Xerxes' demand would mean abandoning everything Sparta believes in. The conflict is therefore not simply about defending land. It is about preserving a way of life. This distinction is essential because it transforms what could have been an ordinary military story into something much more meaningful. If the Spartans were merely defending territory, surrender might seem like a practical solution. But the film frames the conflict in terms of values rather than geography. Freedom, honor, independence, and self-determination become the true objectives. Once those values are established, surrender becomes morally impossible for Leonidas, regardless of the military odds. The film carefully demonstrates that Leonidas understands the enormous risk he is taking. He never believes victory will come easily. In fact, one of the most compelling aspects of his character is that he accepts the possibility of death almost immediately. This creates an unusual form of dramatic tension. Many action films rely on uncertainty about whether the hero will survive. In 300, the audience quickly realizes that survival is not the central question. Instead, the question becomes how the Spartans will choose to face inevitable sacrifice. This shift changes the emotional experience of the film. Every battle carries significance not because viewers wonder if Leonidas will suddenly find a miraculous escape, but because each confrontation demonstrates the values he represents. Every successful defense of the past delays defeat, while strengthening the legend that will survive long after the warriors themselves are gone. The military conflict is intensified by the overwhelming imbalance between the opposing forces. The Persian Empire commands an enormous army composed of soldiers from countless conquered nations. The Spartans number only 300, accompanied by several thousand allied Greek soldiers who receive much less attention in the film. From a purely numerical perspective, the outcome appears hopeless. The filmmakers repeatedly emphasize this imbalance through visual storytelling. Wide shots reveal endless Persian ranks stretching across the landscape. The horizon itself seems consumed by soldiers. Massive war machines, towering creatures, and enormous ships reinforce the impression that Persia possesses virtually unlimited resources. By contrast, the Spartans occupy a tiny portion of the screen. Their red cloaks stand out against the vast armies surrounding them. This visual contrast constantly reminds the audience of the impossible challenge facing the defenders. However, the film immediately introduces another conflict that complicates the situation: intelligence versus numbers. Leonidas chooses Thermopylae because its narrow passage prevents the Persian army from using its full strength. Geography becomes a weapon. The conflict, therefore, evolves into a contest between strategy and brute force. This tactical dimension keeps the battle interesting throughout the narrative. Instead of relying solely on physical strength, Leonidas repeatedly adapts his formations and timing to exploit the terrain. The audience watches not just warriors fighting, but experienced leaders solving military problems under extreme pressure. The famous Spartan phalanx formation illustrates this perfectly. Individual soldiers are dangerous, but together they become nearly unstoppable. Their shields interlock. Spears extend outward in coordinated lines. Every man protects the warrior beside him. This creates another layer of conflict: individual desire versus collective responsibility. Throughout the film, Spartan warriors constantly suppress personal ambition for the benefit of the group. Glory comes not from acting alone, but from maintaining discipline within the formation. This idea reaches its clearest expression when Leonidas reminds his men that each shield primarily protects the soldier standing next to them. The statement is deeply symbolic. Survival depends upon mutual trust rather than individual heroics. The conflict is therefore not only between Spartans and Persians, but also between selfishness and unity. Political conflict also plays a significant role in maintaining tension. Before Leonidas can confront Persia, he must deal with the traditions and institutions of Sparta itself. Although he is king, his authority is not absolute. Religious customs require consultation with the ephors before declaring war. The refusal of the ephors creates an obstacle that is entirely separate from the Persian threat. Leonidas now faces opposition from within his own society. This internal political conflict adds complexity to the story because it demonstrates that leadership often involves overcoming resistance from allies as well as enemies. The political storyline continues through Queen Gorgo. While Leonidas fights at Thermopylae, she battles corruption, manipulation, and betrayal within Sparta. Her struggle mirrors Leonidas' military campaign in several important ways. Both characters fight against powerful forces that appear stronger than themselves. Both refuse to compromise their principles. Both understand that personal sacrifice may be necessary to achieve a greater purpose. One of the defining characteristics of 300 is the way it presents its antagonists. Unlike many historical films that portray enemies as ordinary political rivals, 300 transforms its opposing forces into larger-than-life figures that symbolize ideas as much as individuals. The film's villains are not simply obstacles standing between the protagonist and victory. Instead, they represent temptation, corruption, tyranny, fear, betrayal, overwhelming power, and the many different forms that opposition can take. Some antagonists are physical enemies on the battlefield, while others operate through politics, manipulation, or psychological pressure. Together, they create a network of opposing forces that constantly challenge Leonidas and his men on every possible level. The most obvious antagonist is King Xerxes, the ruler of the Persian Empire. Historically, Xerxes was one of the most powerful monarchs of the ancient world, commanding an empire that stretched across vast regions of Asia, Africa, and Europe. In the film, however, he is presented not as a conventional historical figure, but as an almost mythical being. This creative choice immediately distinguishes him from traditional cinematic villains. When audiences first hear about Xerxes, he exists more as an idea than as a person. His reputation arrives long before he does. Persian messengers speak of his unimaginable power. Entire nations have already surrendered to him. His armies seem endless. Before viewers ever see him, the film has already established him as a force capable of reshaping the world. This technique is highly effective because anticipation often makes a villain more intimidating than immediate exposure. The audience imagines someone whose influence extends far beyond ordinary kingship. By the time Xerxes finally appears, expectations have been carefully built over multiple scenes. His introduction is deliberately theatrical. Rather than arriving as an ordinary military commander, Xerxes emerges surrounded by luxury, mystery, and overwhelming spectacle. His appearance immediately communicates that he views himself as something greater than human. Towering above everyone around him, covered in elaborate jewelry and gold ornaments, with a perfectly smooth appearance and an almost supernatural calm, he resembles a living deity more than a political leader. This visual design serves an important narrative purpose. Leonidas is consistently portrayed as grounded, physical, and connected to his people. Xerxes, by contrast, appears detached from ordinary humanity. Every aspect of his appearance reinforces distance rather than familiarity. The enormous height of Xerxes contributes significantly to this impression. Although achieved through filmmaking techniques rather than literal size, the effect transforms him into an almost godlike presence. Whenever Leonidas stands before him, the audience sees not merely two rulers negotiating, but two opposing visions of leadership confronting one another. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of Xerxes as a villain is that he rarely relies on rage or emotional outbursts. Unlike many cinematic antagonists who constantly threaten or scream at their enemies, Xerxes speaks with remarkable calmness. He offers wealth, comfort, titles, and power before resorting to violence. This makes him psychologically dangerous. He attempts to defeat Leonidas through temptation rather than force. He believes every person has a price, and his confidence comes from centuries of successful conquest. The conversations between Xerxes and Leonidas reveal this strategy clearly. Xerxes repeatedly invites Leonidas to kneel. In exchange, he promises unimaginable rewards. He does not initially ask Leonidas to betray Sparta through violence. Instead, he asks him to surrender his principles voluntarily. This transforms their relationship into more than a military rivalry. It becomes a philosophical debate. Leonidas believes freedom requires sacrifice. Xerxes believes submission brings prosperity. Their conflict therefore represents two fundamentally different understandings of power. Another reason Xerxes functions effectively as a villain is that he embodies excess in every possible form. Everything surrounding him appears enormous. His armies are vast. His wealth is limitless. His palaces overflow with luxury. Even his appearance reflects extravagance rather than restraint. This excess directly contrasts Spartan simplicity. Leonidas wears practical armor, carries basic weapons, and lives according to strict discipline. Xerxes surrounds himself with luxury, ornamentation, and displays of overwhelming wealth. Through this visual opposition, the film communicates ideological conflict without requiring lengthy explanations. Every scene involving Xerxes reminds viewers that the story is ultimately about competing value systems. However, Xerxes is not the film's only antagonist. One of the most powerful opposing forces is the Persian army itself. Rather than presenting the army as a collection of ordinary soldiers, the film portrays almost as a force of nature. Endless ranks stretch beyond the horizon. Every defeated wave is replaced by another. The army seems infinite. This creates a unique kind of villain. Instead of relying solely on an individual antagonist, the movie transforms sheer scale into an enemy. The audience experiences the same overwhelming pressure that the Spartans face. No matter how many victories Leonidas achieves, another army always appears. This endless progression reinforces themes of perseverance. Courage becomes meaningful because the challenge never disappears. Among the Persian forces, several specialized groups function as secondary antagonists. The Immortals are perhaps the most memorable. Historically, they were an elite Persian military unit. In the film, however, they are transformed into mysterious masked warriors whose appearance borders on supernatural. Their masks conceal all facial expressions, making them seem less like human beings and more like living symbols of fear. Their synchronized movements suggest absolute discipline, while their silence creates an unsettling atmosphere. Narratively, the Immortals represent the ultimate military challenge. If ordinary Persian soldiers cannot defeat the Spartans, perhaps these legendary warriors can. When the Spartans eventually overcome them as well, the audience gains even greater appreciation for Spartan skill and determination. The film also introduces numerous monstrous figures within the Persian army. Although 300 is based on a historical legend rather than a traditional fantasy adventure, its narrative closely follows many of the storytelling patterns found in classic heroic myths. King Leonidas is not simply the protagonist of the film. He is portrayed as an archetypal hero whose journey reflects timeless themes of leadership, sacrifice, courage, and legacy. While the movie does not fit every stage of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey exactly, many of its key elements are clearly present. At the same time, the film can also be understood through the three-act structure and elements of Blake Snyder's Save the Cat storytelling model. Examining the story through these frameworks reveals why Leonidas' journey feels so powerful even though the audience already knows the historical outcome. The emotional impact comes not from uncertainty about the ending, but from witnessing how the hero chooses to respond to each challenge placed before him. One of the first stages of the hero's journey is the ordinary world. In many stories, this stage introduces the protagonist before adventure disrupts everyday life. In 300, however, the ordinary world is anything but ordinary. The film opens by showing the harsh reality of Spartan society. Instead of presenting a peaceful kingdom, it introduces a civilization built entirely around discipline, military excellence, and sacrifice. Through the narration of Dilios, viewers learn how Spartan children are raised, how weakness is rejected, and how survival depends on strength and determination. This section establishes the cultural environment that shaped Leonidas. His ordinary world is one where courage is expected, honor is sacred, and service to Sparta comes before personal desire. The film then moves into Leonidas' childhood, showing his education and final survival trial. While these scenes function partly as backstory, they also establish that Leonidas' journey began long before he became king. Like many mythological heroes, he is tested early in life. The confrontation with the wolf represents his first major trial and symbolizes his ability to overcome fear through intelligence rather than brute force. In hero's journey terminology, this sequence resembles the hero's first initiation. Leonidas enters the wilderness alone, faces a deadly challenge, and returns transformed. Although still a boy, he has demonstrated the qualities that will later define him as a leader. The next major stage is the call to adventure. This occurs when the Persian messenger arrives in Sparta, carrying Xerxes' demand for submission. The message changes everything. Leonidas is presented with a clear choice. He can accept Persian rule and preserve peace, or he can resist and risk complete destruction. Unlike many heroes who hesitate before accepting their quests, Leonidas responds almost immediately. His values leave little room for compromise. He understands that surrender would betray everything Sparta represents. This immediate acceptance distinguishes Leonidas from more reluctant heroes found in other stories. Characters such as Luke Skywalker, Frodo Baggins, or Bilbo Baggins initially resist their adventures because they fear the unknown or desire ordinary lives. Leonidas experiences no such uncertainty. His identity as a Spartan king has already prepared him for this moment. The call to adventure is not an interruption of his purpose. It is the fulfillment of it. Interestingly, the film includes a variation of the refusal of the call, but it comes not from Leonidas himself, but from Spartan institutions. The ephors deny permission for military action, claiming that religious law prevents immediate war. This creates an obstacle without changing Leonidas' determination. Instead of refusing the adventure personally, he faces resistance from the society he serves. This variation keeps the story moving while preserving Leonidas' unwavering character. The meeting with the mentor stage appears differently than in many heroes' journey narratives. Leonidas does not have a single wise mentor guiding him throughout the story. Instead, his mentor is Sparta itself. Its traditions, education, discipline, and values have shaped him from childhood. Everything he needs has already been taught through years of preparation. This reflects the film's emphasis on collective culture rather than individual wisdom. The crossing of the first threshold occurs when Leonidas leaves Sparta with his 300 warriors. This moment represents far more than physical departure. By marching toward Thermopylae despite official opposition, Leonidas commits completely to his path. There is no turning back. He has chosen duty over political convenience and accepted whatever consequences follow. Crossing the threshold is often marked by entering an unfamiliar world. In 300, Thermopylae becomes that new world. Although still part of Greece, it functions as a symbolic boundary between civilization and legend. Once Leonidas arrives there, every decision carries historic significance. The Road of Trials occupies the majority of the film. This stage traditionally consists of numerous challenges that test the hero physically, emotionally, and morally. Leonidas encounters one obstacle after another. First comes the arrival of the massive Persian army. Then wave after wave of increasingly dangerous enemies attacks the Spartan position. Ordinary soldiers fail. Elite warriors, known as the Immortals, fail. Gigantic beasts fail. Monstrous executioners fail. Each challenge grows more intimidating than the last. Importantly, these trials are not merely physical contests. Each battle tests Leonidas' leadership. He must maintain discipline under impossible pressure. He must inspire exhausted soldiers. He must make strategic decisions with limited resources. Every victory strengthens his reputation while bringing him closer to inevitable sacrifice. Another essential part of the hero's journey involves allies. Leonidas is never portrayed as succeeding alone. His greatest strength lies in the loyalty of those around him. Captain Artemis, Stelios, Dilios, and the other Spartans fight not because they are forced to, but because they believe completely in their king. This collective heroism distinguishes 300 from stories centered on solitary champions. Even Leonidas' famous speeches emphasize unity rather than individual greatness. The Spartan shield becomes a powerful symbol of this philosophy. Each shield primarily protects the soldier beside it. The metaphor is clear. Heroes succeed through cooperation. The hero's journey also includes encounters with temptation. When 300 was released in 2006, audiences immediately recognized that it looked unlike almost any other film of its time. While the movie's story, characters, and action attracted considerable attention, its visual presentation became one of its defining achievements. The film represented a major step forward in the integration of digital technology, computer-generated imagery, digital cinematography, visual effects, and post-production techniques. Rather than using technology simply to create realistic environments, the filmmakers used it as an artistic tool to recreate the visual style of Frank Miller's graphic novel. Every technological decision served a storytelling purpose, helping transform history into mythology and making the audience feel as though they were watching a living illustration instead of a conventional historical drama. One of the most revolutionary aspects of 300 was its production method. Traditionally, historical epics relied on enormous physical sets, thousands of extras, and location shooting in countries with landscapes resembling the ancient world. Films such as Gladiator, Troy, and Kingdom of Heaven built impressive practical environments, combining real architecture with visual effects when necessary. Zack Snyder and his creative team chose a completely different path. Instead of traveling to Greece or constructing massive outdoor sets, most of 300 was filmed inside a studio using large green screen stages. This approach was inspired partly by the success of Sin City, another adaptation of a Frank Miller graphic novel that embraced digital filmmaking. Snyder believed that attempting to recreate ancient Greece realistically would undermine the stylized nature of the source material. Instead, he wanted complete creative control over every image. As a result, nearly every environment audiences see in the finished movie was created or heavily enhanced through digital technology. Mountains, skies, oceans, battlefields, cliffs, Persian camps, palaces, and even much of the weather were generated or modified during post-production. The actors often performed in front of green screens with very few physical surroundings, requiring them to imagine environments that would not exist until months later. This production method demanded extraordinary planning. Before filming even began, artists created detailed concept paintings, digital storyboards, and three-dimensional environment designs. Every camera angle had to be carefully calculated because the digital backgrounds would later need to match perfectly with the actors' movements. The result was a filmmaking process much closer to animation than traditional live-action production. Rather than capturing reality and enhancing it with effects, the filmmakers essentially built reality from scratch around the performances. One of the biggest technological achievements of the film was its extensive use of computer-generated imagery. However, unlike many visual effects-heavy movies that attempt to make digital work invisible, 300 embraced its artificial appearance. Snyder never wanted audiences to believe they were looking at untouched reality. Instead, the digital imagery intentionally resembled the painted pages of Frank Miller's graphic novel. This artistic decision changed how viewers experienced the movie. The exaggerated skies, dramatic lighting, impossible landscapes, and highly stylized battlefields constantly reminded audiences that they were witnessing a legendary tale rather than a documentary recreation of history. The sky alone demonstrates this philosophy. Throughout the film, sunsets appear richer than they would in nature. Storm clouds gather with almost supernatural intensity. Sunlight cuts dramatically across mountains and soldiers. Every cloud formation contributes emotionally to the scene rather than simply representing realistic weather conditions. The visual effects artists carefully manipulated color, lighting, and atmosphere to produce these painterly environments. Instead of pursuing photographic realism, they focused on emotional realism. Every background reflected the mood of the story. Digital compositing also played an essential role. Compositing is the process of combining multiple visual elements into a single image. In 300, a typical shot might include separately filmed actors, digitally created mountains, computer-generated skies, added smoke, enhanced lighting, flying arrows, blood effects, and animated dust particles. These separate layers were carefully blended together until they appeared as one unified scene. The complexity of this work cannot be overstated. Some individual shots contained dozens of visual layers that had to interact convincingly. Shadows needed to match the digital environment. Reflections had to respond correctly to virtual lighting. Smoke had to move naturally across both real and computer-generated elements. Despite relying so heavily on digital technology, the filmmakers understood that performances remained the emotional foundation of the movie. The actors therefore underwent extensive physical preparation before filming began. Gerard, Butler, and the other performers completed demanding training programs designed to develop athletic physiques suitable for Spartan warriors. Rather than relying entirely on digital enhancement, the production wanted the actors' bodies to communicate years of military discipline. This commitment to practical preparation strengthened the visual effects. When audiences saw the Spartans fighting, much of their physical appearance was genuine. Computer-generated imagery enhanced the environments rather than replacing the performers themselves. The choreography of combat represented another remarkable technological achievement. Every battle was carefully planned long before filming through detailed pre-visualization. Pre-visualization involves creating simplified digital versions of scenes before actual production begins. Directors use these digital models to test camera movements, action choreography, and visual compositions. For 300, pre-visualization proved especially valuable because so much of the environment existed only digitally. The filmmakers could experiment with camera angles, timing, and action long before actors stepped onto the stage. This planning contributed significantly to the movie's smooth visual storytelling. Despite the enormous scale of the battles, audiences rarely become confused about spatial relationships or character positions. Although 300 is often remembered for its breathtaking visuals, stylized action, and memorable dialogue, its lasting success cannot be explained by spectacle alone. Many films feature impressive battle scenes and elaborate visual effects, yet they fail to leave a lasting emotional impression. What separates 300 from countless other action films is its ability to create genuine emotional investment beneath its larger-than-life presentation. Every major battle, speech, sacrifice, and decision is built upon universal human emotions that audiences understand regardless of culture or historical knowledge. Themes such as courage, loyalty, honor, family, sacrifice, leadership, freedom, and legacy give the film emotional weight that extends far beyond its action sequences. Even viewers who know the historical outcome find themselves deeply moved because the film focuses not on whether the Spartans survive, but on why they choose to fight in the first place. One of the strongest emotional foundations of the film is the relationship between Leonidas and Sparta itself. Unlike many protagonists whose primary motivation is personal survival or individual ambition, Leonidas is driven almost entirely by responsibility. From the very beginning, the audience understands that he views himself as a servant of his people rather than their master. This distinction creates immediate respect. Viewers are far more likely to connect emotionally with leaders who accept responsibility rather than pursue personal gain. Leonidas never seeks glory for its own sake. Every decision he makes is based on what he believes will best serve Sparta and preserve its ideals. Because of this selflessness, audiences naturally begin rooting for him. His courage feels authentic because it is directed toward protecting something larger than himself. The opening scenes depicting Leonidas' childhood also establish emotional investment surprisingly early. Watching him endure Spartan training allows viewers to understand that his confidence was earned rather than inherited. The confrontation with the wolf is not merely an exciting action sequence. It symbolizes the hardships that shaped the man he would become. By witnessing his early struggles, audiences feel that they know Leonidas before he becomes the legendary king. This creates a stronger emotional connection than simply introducing him as an already perfect warrior. Another major source of emotional resonance comes from the bond between Leonidas and Queen Gorgo. Their relationship stands out because it is built upon mutual respect rather than conventional romance. Many historical epics include love stories that exist primarily to provide emotional contrast with warfare. In 300, however, Leonidas and Gorgo already possess a mature, trusting partnership. Their conversations reveal equality rather than dependence. Gorgo advises Leonidas honestly. Leonidas values her judgment. Neither character attempts to dominate the other. This mutual respect strengthens both characters while giving the audience something worth protecting emotionally. Their farewell before Leonidas departs for Thermopylae becomes especially moving because it avoids exaggerated sentimentality. Neither promises impossible futures. Neither pretends everything will be fine. Instead, both understand the reality of the situation while accepting the responsibilities that come with leadership. The restraint shown during these scenes actually increases their emotional power. The audience recognizes that many feelings remain unspoken because words alone cannot fully express them. The film also builds emotional investment through the relationships among the Spartan soldiers. Although there are many warriors, the movie takes time to establish individual personalities. Captain Artemis demonstrates unwavering loyalty. Stelios provides youthful confidence and fearless determination. Dilios serves as both warrior and storyteller. Other Spartans contribute humor, wisdom, or quiet courage. These moments of personality matter greatly because they transform anonymous soldiers into recognizable human beings. When casualties eventually occur, audiences feel genuine loss rather than viewing deaths as simple action spectacle. The camaraderie among the Spartans represents another emotional strength. They joke together, train together, fight together, protect one another. Rather than emphasizing individual heroics, the film constantly celebrates collective identity. This sense of brotherhood becomes one of the movie's most moving qualities. Each warrior understands that survival depends upon the shield beside him. Their unity creates emotional security even amid overwhelming danger. One of the film's most effective emotional techniques involves contrasting moments of quiet reflection with explosive action. After intense battles, the narrative frequently slows down. Characters discuss family. They reflect on duty. They share memories. These calmer scenes allow audiences to process the emotional consequences of everything they have witnessed. Without these quieter moments, the relentless action might become emotionally exhausting. Instead, the film creates a rhythm that alternates excitement with contemplation. Perhaps the single most important emotional theme is sacrifice. From beginning to end, the audience understands that Leonidas and his men may not return home. Unlike many action movies where heroes seem almost invincible, 300 constantly reminds viewers of mortality. Every Spartan knowingly walks toward extraordinary danger. This awareness changes how audiences interpret every scene. Each conversation could be the last. Each victory may only delay defeat. Every smile carries hidden sadness because viewers recognize its temporary nature. The emotional impact grows stronger with each successful defense of Thermopylae. Initially, audiences celebrate Spartan victories. The warriors defeat larger Persian forces through discipline and intelligence. These triumphs generate excitement and admiration. Gradually, however, another emotion begins to emerge: melancholy. No matter how many victories the Spartans achieve, the audience realizes they cannot continue forever. The Persian army remains enormous. Resources diminish. Fatigue increases. Hope slowly gives way to acceptance. This emotional progression is carefully managed throughout the film. Rather than shifting suddenly from confidence to tragedy, the narrative allows viewers to experience the gradual realization that sacrifice has become inevitable. This makes the eventual climax far more powerful. One of the most fascinating aspects of 300 is that it is not a direct adaptation of history, but an adaptation of an adaptation. The film is based on Frank Miller and Lynn Varley's 1998 graphic novel, 300, which itself was inspired by the historical Battle of Thermopylae. This means the filmmakers were not primarily trying to recreate the actual events of 480 BCE. Instead, their goal was to faithfully translate Frank Miller's artistic interpretation of those events into cinematic form. Understanding this distinction is essential because many of the film's most recognizable elements, including its exaggerated characters, stylized battles, fantastical creatures, and mythic atmosphere, come from the graphic novel rather than from historical records. The adaptation process, therefore, involved balancing three different versions of the same story: documented history, Frank Miller's graphic novel, and Zack Snyder's cinematic vision. The historical Battle of Thermopylae has fascinated historians for centuries. According to ancient accounts, King Leonidas of Sparta led a small Greek force in defending the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae against the invading Persian army under King Xerxes I. Although the Greeks were eventually defeated after a hidden path allowed the Persians to surround them, their resistance delayed the Persian advance and became a lasting symbol of courage and sacrifice. Frank Miller was not interested in producing a textbook version of these events. Instead, he sought to capture what the battle had become in cultural memory. His graphic novel deliberately emphasized mythology over historical precision. Heroes became larger than life. Enemies appeared monstrous. Every page resembled a painted legend rather than a historical document. When Zack Snyder began adapting the graphic novel, he made a crucial creative decision that shaped the entire production. Rather than adapting history directly, he would adapt Frank Miller's artwork as faithfully as possible. In many interviews following the film's release, Snyder explained that he viewed the graphic novel almost as a storyboard for the movie. This philosophy influenced nearly every artistic choice. Perhaps the most obvious example of this fidelity is the visual composition. Many scenes in the movie recreate individual panels from the graphic novel almost exactly. Camera angles, character poses, lighting, and battlefield layouts often mirror Miller's illustrations with remarkable precision. This approach distinguishes 300 from many comic book adaptations. Instead of using the source material merely as inspiration, Snyder treated it as the visual blueprint for the film. As a result, audiences familiar with the graphic novel immediately recognized countless moments that had been transferred almost directly from page to screen. One of the greatest strengths of the adaptation is how successfully it preserves the graphic novel's visual identity. Frank Miller's artwork is characterized by bold silhouettes, dramatic contrast, exaggerated anatomy, and highly theatrical compositions. Rather than softening these qualities to create a more realistic historical drama, Snyder embraced them completely. The heavily color-graded cinematography, stylized slow-motion combat, painterly skies, and carefully choreographed action all serve to recreate the feeling of reading the graphic novel. In this respect, the adaptation remains exceptionally faithful. However, adapting a relatively short graphic novel into a feature-length film required significant expansion. The original comic focuses primarily on the events surrounding Thermopylae itself. The movie introduces additional scenes that deepen character relationships, expand political context, and provide greater narrative balance. One of the most significant additions is Queen Gorgo's expanded storyline. In Frank Miller's graphic novel, Gorgo appears briefly and supports Leonidas emotionally, but her role is relatively limited. The film transforms her into one of the central characters. Her political struggle within Sparta occupies a substantial portion of the running time. These new scenes serve several purposes. First, they provide relief from the constant battlefield action. Second, they allow audiences to understand the political consequences of Leonidas' decision. Third, they develop Gorgo into a fully realized character with her own emotional journey. Rather than existing simply as the hero's wife, she becomes an active participant in defending Spartan values. This expansion also strengthens one of the film's central themes. Heroism exists in many forms. Leonidas fights with swords. Gorgo fights with truth and determination. Both display courage under different circumstances. The political subplot involving Theron is another major addition. Theron does not occupy such a prominent role in the graphic novel. The film introduces him as a corrupt politician who manipulates Spartan institutions for personal gain. This subplot creates internal conflict that parallels the external Persian threat. Although some viewers felt these scenes slowed the pacing, they add complexity by showing that civilizations can be endangered from within as well as from outside invasion. The screenplay also expands conversations between Leonidas and his soldiers. The graphic novel often communicates character through visual imagery and concise dialogue. Film audiences generally expect deeper interpersonal relationships. To address this, the adaptation includes numerous quiet moments between battles. The Spartans discuss family. They joke with one another. They reflect on duty. These additions strengthen emotional investment. By the final battle, audiences know these warriors as individuals rather than anonymous soldiers. Leonidas himself receives subtle expansion. Frank Miller's version already presents him as a noble leader, but the film provides more opportunities to explore his relationships with Gorgo, his son, and his fellow Spartans. These scenes humanize the legendary figure without diminishing his heroic stature. Another interesting adaptation choice involves the narration. Both the graphic novel and the film employ Dilios as storyteller. However, cinema allows narration to function differently than printed text. Dilios' voice provides emotional continuity throughout the movie while reinforcing the idea that audiences are witnessing a legend rather than objective history. One of the reasons 300 continues to reward repeat viewings is the extraordinary amount of detail hidden throughout the film. While most viewers remember the spectacular battles, memorable dialogue, and distinctive visual style, many smaller elements are easy to overlook during a first viewing. These include visual references to the original graphic novel, symbolic imagery, subtle foreshadowing, historical nods, recurring motifs, costume details, camera techniques, and carefully placed storytelling clues that enrich the narrative. Some of these details were intentionally included by the filmmakers as tributes to Frank Miller's source material, while others help reinforce the film's themes of courage, sacrifice, leadership, and legacy. Although 300 is often viewed primarily as an action film, its visual language is surprisingly layered, rewarding audiences who pay close attention. One of the earliest hidden details appears during the opening narration describing Spartan society. The sequence showing young Leonidas training is not simply background information. Nearly every lesson taught during his childhood later returns during the Battle of Thermopylae. The confrontation with the wolf is perhaps the clearest example. At first glance, it appears to be a simple survival test. However, Leonidas defeats the wolf not through greater physical strength, but by using intelligence and the environment to his advantage. Years later, he applies exactly the same strategy against Xerxes' vastly larger army. Thermopylae itself becomes a narrow cave where the wolf once attacked. The Persians become the larger predator. Leonidas again overcomes overwhelming strength through positioning and tactical awareness. This parallel subtly tells audiences that the qualities making Leonidas successful as a king were established long before adulthood. The wolf itself carries symbolic meaning. In mythology, wolves frequently represent danger, chaos, or nature's harsh realities. By defeating the animal without reckless aggression, Leonidas demonstrates that wisdom and patience are equally important to courage. This lesson quietly influences his leadership throughout the movie. Another recurring visual motif involves shields. Most viewers naturally focus on Spartan spears because they produce many of the film's memorable action moments. However, Leonidas repeatedly emphasizes that the shield is the most important weapon. Historically, Spartan shields protected the entire formation rather than only individual soldiers. The movie reinforces this idea visually. Whenever the Spartans fight effectively, their shields remain tightly connected. Whenever formations begin breaking apart, danger immediately increases. This creates subtle visual storytelling. Without dialogue, audiences gradually understand that unity provides greater strength than individual heroism. The shield therefore becomes a symbol of collective responsibility rather than simple military equipment. One fascinating hidden detail involves the use of color throughout the film. The Spartans are almost always associated with warm colors: gold, bronze, deep red, orange firelight. These colors communicate warmth, humanity, courage, and sacrifice. By contrast, Persian scenes frequently emphasize cooler tones: blue, gray, dark green, shadow. These choices create subconscious emotional responses. Even without recognizing the pattern consciously, audiences instinctively associate Sparta with life and Persia with emotional distance. The famous red Spartan cloaks carry multiple layers of meaning. Historically, Spartans did wear red cloaks, partly because the color concealed blood during battle. Within the film, however, the the cloaks become much more symbolic. Red represents sacrifice, honor, identity. Even after warriors fall, their cloaks remain visually striking against the battlefield. The color reminds viewers that Spartan ideals survive individual deaths. Throughout the movie, Zack Snyder frequently recreates exact compositions from Frank Miller's graphic novel. Some shots are so precise that they appear almost identical to the original illustrations. For viewers familiar with the comic, recognizing these moments becomes an ongoing visual treasure hunt. Individual poses, battle formations, camera angles, silhouettes, even specific facial expressions mirror Miller's artwork. Rather than simply borrowing the story, Snyder consistently honors the visual language of the graphic novel. Another subtle storytelling detail involves Leonidas' posture. Whenever he appears before his soldiers, he almost always stands upright with open body language. His movements project confidence and certainty. Xerxes, however, frequently reclines, sits elevated above others, or remains physically distant from those around him. These contrasting postures communicate their leadership philosophies without requiring explanation. Leonidas leads beside his people. Xerxes rules above them. This visual distinction reinforces the ideological conflict central to the story. Eyes receive remarkable emphasis throughout the film. Close-up shots repeatedly focus on characters' expressions before major decisions. Leonidas' gaze remains calm, even under pressure. Gorgo's eyes communicate determination during political confrontations. Ephialtes frequently avoids direct eye contact after his rejection, subtly foreshadowing his emotional isolation. These visual choices encourage audiences to understand character psychology through observation rather than exposition. Foreshadowing appears surprisingly early in the narrative. During Leonidas' departure from Sparta, several conversations hint that his journey may not end with his return. Characters rarely discuss future celebrations. Instead, they focus on duty, honor, and remembrance. This prepares audiences emotionally for eventual sacrifice without revealing specific plot developments. Because the story is based on well-known history, suspense comes less from uncertainty about survival than from understanding how events unfold. The filmmakers therefore use foreshadowing to build emotional inevitability rather than surprise. The famous phrase about Spartan warriors returning, with your shield or on it, carries deeper significance than many viewers initially realize. The commercial success of 300 is one of the most remarkable stories in modern Hollywood history. Before its release in 2007, the film was considered a risky project. Although it was based on Frank Miller's respected graphic novel, the source material was relatively niche compared to major comic book franchises like Batman, Spider-Man, or Superman. The film also featured an unconventional visual style, extensive use of digital environments, highly stylized violence, and a historical setting that did not fit neatly into any proven blockbuster formula. Many industry observers wondered whether mainstream audiences would embrace such a unique production. Instead, 300 became one of the biggest financial surprises of its decade, earning hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide, transforming Zack Snyder into one of Hollywood's most recognizable directors, dramatically increasing Frank Miller's visibility with general audiences, and influencing how studios evaluated comic book adaptations and visually stylized action films. The financial story of 300 begins long before audiences ever saw the finished film. Developing the project required convincing a major studio that Frank Miller's graphic novel could attract a worldwide audience. Although the comic had earned critical praise, it was not nearly as famous as superhero properties that traditionally dominated comic book adaptations. This created uncertainty. Unlike established franchises, there was little evidence showing how large the potential audience might be. The filmmakers therefore had to present the project as something more than another comic book adaptation. They emphasized its visual innovation, mythological storytelling, and epic scale. The production budget reflected both ambition and caution. While expensive, it remained significantly smaller than many historical epics produced during the same era. Large-scale historical films often required enormous spending on location shooting, practical sets, thousands of costumes, and massive armies of extras. 300 reduced many of these costs by embracing digital filmmaking. Most environments were created using green screen technology and computer-generated imagery rather than expensive physical construction. This production strategy allowed the filmmakers to create spectacular visuals without matching the budgets of traditional sword and sandal epics. The budget has generally been reported at approximately $60 to $65 million. For a visually ambitious action film featuring extensive visual effects, this represented a relatively efficient production. Hollywood studios carefully monitor budget because profitability depends not simply on ticket sales, but on the relationship between production costs and total revenue. In the case of 300, the moderate budget created an opportunity for exceptional financial returns if audiences responded positively. Marketing became one of the film's greatest strengths. Rather than attempting to sell the movie as a traditional historical drama, the promotional campaign focused almost entirely on its unique visual identity. Trailers emphasized slow-motion combat, highly stylized cinematography, powerful dialogue, the distinctive red Spartan cloaks, massive battle scenes, Gerard Butler's commanding performance as Leonidas. These marketing materials immediately distinguished the movie from other historical films. Audiences recognized within seconds that 300 offered a completely different cinematic experience. One of the smartest marketing decisions involved highlighting memorable dialogue. Certain lines from the trailers quickly spread across television, internet forums, and early social media platforms. Even people unfamiliar with the graphic novel became curious after repeatedly hearing these dramatic moments. The trailers themselves functioned almost like miniature action films. Rather than explaining complex historical context, they focused on emotion, spectacle, and unforgettable imagery. The release strategy also contributed significantly to the film's success. 300 premiered during a period that allowed it to dominate the box office without facing overwhelming competition from multiple major blockbusters released simultaneously. Positive audience reactions generated strong word-of-mouth publicity. Viewers frequently recommended the film based on its visual uniqueness. Many returned for repeat viewings simply to experience the action sequences again. Opening weekend performance immediately exceeded expectations. The film earned well over $70 million during its first weekend in North America alone. This represented one of the strongest openings ever achieved by an R-rated film at that time. Industry analysts quickly recognized that 300 had become much more than a modest comic book adaptation. It was now a major cultural event. Strong opening weekends matter enormously in Hollywood. They influence media coverage, encourage additional theater bookings, increase audience curiosity, and often determine whether studios view a project as a major success. 300's opening instantly established financial momentum that continued throughout its theatrical run. Domestic box office performance remained impressive for several weeks. Unlike films that experienced steep declines after opening weekend, 300 demonstrated relatively strong audience retention. Repeat business played an important role. Many viewers returned to theaters with friends or family members after describing the film's unique visual style. This repeat attendance significantly increased total earnings. International markets proved equally important. Historical epics often perform well overseas because their themes translate easily across cultures. Courage, sacrifice, leadership, freedom. These universal ideas resonate regardless of language. Additionally, the spectacular action required relatively little cultural explanation. As a result, 300 attracted large audiences across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and numerous other international territories. By the conclusion of its theatrical run, worldwide box office revenue exceeded $450 million. Compared to its reported production budget of approximately $60 to $65 million. This represented an extraordinary financial achievement. Even after accounting for marketing expenses, theater revenue sharing, and distribution costs, the film generated enormous profits. Its return on investment became one of the most impressive among major Hollywood releases of its era. Very few action films from the 2000s have maintained the kind of passionate fan following that 300 continues to enjoy. While many movies become successful during their theatrical release and gradually fade from public discussion, 300 has remained part of popular culture for nearly 2 decades. Its memorable dialogue, iconic visuals, larger-than-life characters, and themes of courage and sacrifice have inspired an active community of fans across multiple generations. From online discussions and social media to cosplay, fan art, historical debates, internet memes, conventions, fitness communities, and filmmaking analysis, the movie has continued to generate conversation long after its original release. The fandom surrounding 300 is particularly interesting because it extends beyond traditional movie enthusiasts. Historians, comic book readers, military enthusiasts, fitness fans, filmmakers, artists, and even internet meme creators have all embraced different aspects of the film, giving it a cultural presence that reaches far beyond its original audience. One of the earliest signs that 300 had become more than just another successful action film was the immediate reaction from audiences following its theatrical release. Viewers did not simply recommend the movie to friends. They began quoting it almost immediately. Certain lines of dialogue quickly entered popular culture. "This is Sparta. Tonight, we dine in hell. Come and get them." These quotes spread rapidly through conversations, internet forums, online videos, and eventually social media. Unlike many movie quotations that remain confined to film fans, these phrases became recognizable even among people who had never actually seen a movie. The delivery of these lines played a major role in their popularity. Gerard Butler's performance gave them enormous energy and conviction. Fans often attempted to imitate his voice, gestures, and intensity. This transformed simple dialogue into shared cultural references. Even years later, these lines continue appearing in conversations, internet comments, sports events, comedy sketches, and gaming communities. Perhaps no moment has had a greater impact on internet culture than Leonidas kicking the Persian messenger into the pit while shouting, "This is Sparta." The scene quickly evolved into one of the earliest major internet memes. Countless parody videos appeared online. Television programs referenced it. Comedy shows recreated it. Animated series produced humorous tributes. Video game players recreated the moment using in-game characters. The phrase became shorthand for exaggerated confidence or dramatic rejection. Few films from the era produced a single scene with such lasting online influence. The rise of platforms like YouTube also contributed significantly to the growth of the fandom. Short clips featuring battle sequences, speeches, and motivational moments accumulated millions of views. Fan-made tribute videos combined scenes from the movie with dramatic music, historical footage, or inspirational narration. These videos introduced younger audiences to the film years after its theatrical release. Many people discovered 300 through online clips before eventually watching the complete movie. Social media later expanded the fan community even further. Platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, X, Reddit, TikTok, and YouTube allowed fans to share artwork, edits, discussions, theories, historical comparisons, and favorite scenes. The movie's highly recognizable visual style made it especially popular for image-based content. Slow-motion edits, wallpaper collections, character artwork, fitness transformations inspired by Spartan training, motivational quotes placed over dramatic screenshots. These became common forms of fan expression. One of the most interesting aspects of the fandom is its relationship with history. Unlike purely fictional fantasy films, 300 constantly encourages discussion about the real Battle of Thermopylae. Many viewers become curious about the actual historical events after watching the movie. This curiosity often leads them to books, documentaries, podcasts, museum exhibits, and historical articles exploring ancient Greece. Historians frequently discuss which aspects of the film reflect documented events and which originate from Frank Miller's artistic interpretation. These conversations have continued for years. Although debates sometimes become passionate, they also demonstrate the movie's educational influence. Many people first learned about Leonidas and Thermopylae because of the film before later exploring genuine historical scholarship. Comic book fans represent another important part of the community. Readers familiar with Frank Miller's original graphic novel often compare specific scenes with their illustrated counterparts. Many admire how faithfully Zack Snyder recreated individual comic panels. Online discussions frequently place comic pages beside corresponding movie frames, highlighting the remarkable visual similarities. These comparisons have strengthened appreciation for the adaptation among graphic novel enthusiasts. Cosplay has also become an enduring part of the fandom. At comic conventions, movie conventions, and pop culture events around the world, fans regularly appear dressed as Leonidas, Queen Gorgo, Xerxes, Spartan warriors, or members of the Persian army. Spartan costumes remain especially popular because they are instantly recognizable. The red cloak, bronze shield, spear, helmet. These simple but iconic design elements allow fans to recreate the film's imagery with remarkable accuracy. Some cosplay groups organize large gatherings featuring dozens of Spartans posing together for photographs. These events celebrate not only the movie, but also the sense of brotherhood portrayed throughout the story. Fan art represents another major creative outlet. Artists have produced thousands of illustrations inspired by the movie. Some recreate famous scenes with extraordinary detail. Others reinterpret characters using different artistic styles such as watercolor, anime, realism, digital painting, or minimalist design. Many artists combine imagery from the film with historical elements absent from the movie itself, creating unique interpretations that blend mythology with documented history. Digital artists have also created alternate posters imagining different visual approaches while preserving the film's iconic compositions to training methods. When 300 premiered in 2007, it immediately became one of the most talked about films of the year. Audiences were captivated by its groundbreaking visual style, unforgettable action sequences, and larger-than-life performances, while critics were far more divided. Some praised the film as a bold artistic achievement that successfully translated the look and feel of Frank Miller's graphic novel into live-action cinema. Others criticized its historical inaccuracies, stylized violence, simplistic narrative, and portrayal of the Persian Empire. In the years since its release, however, the conversation surrounding 300 has evolved considerably. Nearly 2 decades later, the film occupies a unique place in modern cinema. It is remembered not only as a commercial success or a visually spectacular action film, but also as one of the defining stylistic works of the 2000s. Time has allowed audiences, critics, historians, filmmakers, and scholars to evaluate the movie from multiple perspectives, leading to a more balanced understanding of both its strengths and its shortcomings. One of the most significant changes in the film's reputation concerns its visual style. At the time of release, many viewers had never seen a major Hollywood production look quite like 300. Its heavy use of digital backgrounds, dramatic color grading, stylized slow motion, and comic book-inspired compositions immediately distinguished it from traditional historical epics. Some critics initially argued that the film relied too heavily on computer-generated imagery and sacrificed realism for spectacle. Others praised it for proving that digital technology could be used as an artistic tool rather than simply a method of creating realistic special effects. With the passage of time, this second viewpoint has become increasingly influential. Today, many filmmakers and film historians recognize 300 as one of the most visually influential movies of its era. Its distinctive aesthetic inspired countless later productions across cinema, television, advertising, and video games. Modern audiences, having grown accustomed to highly stylized digital filmmaking, often appreciate how innovative the movie appeared in 2007. Rather than seeing the visual effects as excessive, many now recognize them as essential to the film's artistic identity. Another important aspect of the film's reassessment involves Zack Snyder himself. When 300 was released, Snyder was still establishing his reputation as a filmmaker. Since then, he has directed numerous high-profile projects that have generated passionate debate among audiences. As a result, many viewers have returned to 300 to better understand the development of his directing style. Looking back, the film clearly contains many techniques that would later become associated with Snyder's filmmaking. His use of slow-motion action, his emphasis on striking visual compositions, his fascination with mythic storytelling, his focus on larger-than-life heroes, his willingness to prioritize symbolic imagery over strict realism. These characteristics are all fully present in 300. For supporters of Snyder's work, the movie is often viewed as one of the purest expressions of his artistic vision. Even some critics who disagree with his later creative choices acknowledge that 300 represents one of his most focused and stylistically unified achievements. The performances have also aged well in the eyes of many audiences. Gerard Butler's portrayal of Leonidas remains one of the defining performances of his career. His commanding voice, physical presence, emotional sincerity, and memorable delivery continue to resonate with viewers. Many action heroes from the early 2000s have faded from public memory, but Leonidas remains instantly recognizable. His dialogue continues to be quoted, referenced, and parroted nearly 20 years later. This enduring popularity reflects not only the writing, but also Butler's charismatic performance. Lena Headey's portrayal of Queen Gorgo has likewise gained increased appreciation. At the time of release, much of the public discussion centered on the spectacular battle scenes. Over the years, many viewers have recognized how important Gorgo's political storyline is to the film's emotional balance. Her courage differs from Leonidas, but proves equally important. Modern audiences often appreciate this narrative contrast more than they did during the original theatrical release. Another area of reassessment involves the movie's themes. Initially, many discussions focused almost entirely on the action. Today, viewers more frequently explore its ideas about leadership, sacrifice, freedom, responsibility, and legacy. Leonidas is increasingly viewed not simply as a fearless warrior, but as a leader willing to place collective well-being above personal survival. His decisions continue inspiring conversations about leadership in military, business, educational, and motivational contexts. The film's exploration of sacrifice has also gained greater appreciation. Rather than portraying victory through survival, 300 argues that some victories are measured through inspiration. Leonidas loses the battle. His example ultimately helps unite Greece. This thematic emphasis has allowed the movie to remain emotionally meaningful even for audiences already familiar with the historical outcome. Of course, not every aspect of the film has received more positive evaluation over time. Historical accuracy remains one of its most frequently debated subjects. Historians continue pointing out numerous departures from documented events. The Spartan armor, the enormous Persian army, the fantastical creatures, the exaggerated portrayal of Xerxes, the simplified political context. These criticisms remain valid when the film is evaluated as historical reconstruction. However, modern discussions increasingly distinguish between historical accuracy and artistic intention. Most contemporary viewers recognize that 300 was never attempting to function as a documentary. Instead, it adapts Frank Miller's graphic novel, which intentionally presents mythology rather than objective history. This distinction has become central to many modern reassessments. Rather than asking whether the film accurately depicts ancient Greece, many critics now ask whether it successfully translates the spirit of its source material. Viewed from this perspective, the adaptation is generally considered remarkably faithful.